Who makes decisions? Who lives where? And that will help you kind of expand and think about more about your own communities. It's all about context in a lot of ways. So I work for an organization that's been around since the mid-1950s called Interfaith Ministries for Greater Houston. Our tagline's the strength of shared beliefs, and there is our motto, dialogue, collaboration, and service as a demonstration of our shared beliefs. Dialogue, collaboration, and service, strength of shared beliefs. We're Houston's oldest interfaith service organization. We're primarily known for 3 service areas. First and foremost, we run Harris County's largest Meals on Wheels program. That's 4,000 meals every weekday and a host of other services. So one of the most popular one is we deliver about 96,000 pounds of pet food every year. We've been doing that for about 10 years because we realized that many of our seniors, all of our clients are over the age of 60 and homebound, had pets because they're wonderful companions, but they couldn't afford pet food. So we provide pet food for them. And just a couple of things, college students packing pet food, breakfast bags for 1,200 of our most food vulnerable seniors, so that not only do they get lunch, but they get breakfast as well. We also run a refugee services resettlement program. These are a little outdated. We help resettle about 1,500 refugees into the Houston area every year. These are folks with legal refugee status that comes from this incredibly complicated refugee network that is administered by the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees and then as well as the State Department. It's an 18 to 24-month process for someone to work their way through the refugee system and to get resettled someplace else. It's a very, very detailed, elaborate system with at least 4 distinct checkpoints. And when they come to Houston, we meet them at airport, ESL, kids in school, all sorts of things. I work for Interfaith Relations, and of course, I'll make it and I direct this department, of course, I'll make it the biggest square. And we do a lot of things. We work, and I'll talk a little bit more about Houston in a moment. People call us and say, we'd love to see a synagogue, a temple, and a mosque. Can you help us do that? And we say, absolutely. Because a lot of my department's work is developing relationships and connections. Relationships and connections. Speaker requests. Could you have someone come speak to my Sunday school class about Buddhism? And I would say, are they adults or are they youth? Because we know people in the Houston area, some are good with certain age groups. A lot of networking, a lot of resources, a lot of work behind the scenes, trying to build those relationships so that when those relationships are needed, they're in place. Because as you probably know from experience, when you need a relationship, when things are going poorly, or when you really need to have those connections, you need to have them in place long before you need them. We're known for the last 10 years of working with our Dinner Dialogue program, bringing people from diverse traditions together around tables big and small to learn from one another. And this picture probably summarizes a lot of the work we do. People from different backgrounds, particularly different religious traditions, getting together to learn from one another. All right? I'll skip through those. We also do work with youth service and educational events for faith leaders as well. So this is me. I describe myself, as it said on the flyer, a half Asian, Midwestern-raised, Jesuit-educated, Harvard-trained, Texas-residing Presbyterian minister. I've been in Houston for the last 18 years in a variety of venues, ranging from hospital chaplaincy to teaching high school to pastoring churches to where I am right now. I want to talk to you really a lot about religious literacy. What do I mean by religious literacy? It's a complex, it's a long definition, but I think it's the most complete one that I've seen. Basic understanding of history, sacred texts, beliefs, rituals, and current manifestations of multiple faith traditions. So it's having some baseline understanding of the facts and figures of religions, and the ability to understand the intersection of religions and social, political, cultural life through multiple lenses. So it's not only having a baseline level of knowledge, but knowing how to apply that information. So one of the things that I really work on in my work in the Houston area is a notion of religious literacy. How can I help people learn more about religions, learn more about these people who practice religions, and then have civil, intelligent conversations about how religion and life, how religion and culture, how religion and events, how they interact, how they work together, how they create problems. Because I would find in many ways we're in a very religious, illiterate society. And we're often most religiously illiterate about our own traditions, ironically. Isn't that the case? Because that's the one that we've grown up with. So if we were forced to explain our own religious tradition to somebody, we may have trouble, because it's like explaining, if English is your first language, it's trying to teach someone how to speak English. You just do it. That's just your experience. Unless you've been trained how to teach English, how to know how a gerund works, or an infinitive works, or an infinitive absolute, or a participial phrase, you'd never know how to do that. That's actually the benefits in many ways of learning about other religions. It's the same way that learning about other languages is very helpful in learning. I remember I didn't really learn about English grammar and syntax effectively until I learned a foreign language. Because in a foreign language like Spanish, or French, or German, or Arabic, or Hebrew, you're learning the part of speech in a language you don't know. And so you're learning what a gerund is, for example. Anybody don't remember what a gerund is? Okay. But I'd have to ask myself, well, how does a gerund function in my native language? Oh, that's how that works. Oh, so this is how it works in this other language as well. So learning, I think, about other religions is helpful because in many ways it helps you learn more about your own religious tradition. So, okay, here's a quiz. A little audience participation. First set of questions is from a 2006 book called Religious Literacy by a Boston University professor named Stephen Prothero. It's very unscientific. The pool is 300 students. The second set of questions is from the 2010 Religious Knowledge Quiz from the Pew Forum. 3,600 surveys, so it's statistically significant. The Pew Forum knows how to do surveys. All right, are you ready? Okay, question 1. Name the 4 Gospels. List as many as you can. And real, I'm asking for real. So name one. Okay, wait. You can just give me one. Give me one. Give me another one. Mark. And, okay, excellent. Out of 122 students he had in 2006, 175, so a total of about 300. The average score was 2.3 out of 4. These are college sophomores mostly, in one of Prothero's introductory classes.
And were they Hindu or other language? They were all...
No, they're all, no, they're all, what they have in common is that they're all mostly college sophomores at Boston University taking an intro to religion class. They could be, hopefully, from a wide variety. Name one sacred text of Hinduism, just one. Bhagavad Gita, excellent. Could you name another one? Okay. 26% of those 300 students could name one, and there's a bunch of them.
We didn't even get that many here.
I know, we got one, that's all you needed. Name the holy book of Islam. The Quran, okay? 85% of the students could get that correct. George W., spoke in his first inaugural speech of the Jericho Road. What Bible story was he invoking? There's a man going from Jerusalem to Jericho. No, it's not Paul's conversion. It is a parable. The parable of the Good Samaritan. Absolutely. 3% of those 300 students could identify it. Probably Jesus' most famous parable. Okay. What are the first 5 books of the Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, First Testament? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. 12% could name all 5. The average was 1.6. Name the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. Okay. 17% could name the 4. God helps those who help themselves. Is it in the Bible? If so, where? So answer the first question. Is it in the Bible? Okay. 77% knew it was not from the Bible. It is, and in many ways, it is antithetical to the gospel. God helps those who cannot help themselves. All right, 7 sacraments in Catholic theology and liturgy. We'll name as many as you can. Communion, baptism, okay, those are the easy ones. Marriage. Confirmation. End of life. Something happens at the end of life. Ordination. All right, good. 2.5% could get all 7. That's a difficult one. Okay, what is Ramadan? It is a religious holiday. Is it more than a religious? How long is this holiday? It is a month. Sorry, I'm kind of in the way here. I'll get it. And in what religion is it celebrated? Islam. 62% of those 300 students knew it was Islamic, and 38% knew it was a fast. It lasts a month. It's a lunar month, so it lasts about 30 days. It travels backwards 11 days through our solar calendar. So it's right now, it started June 6th of 2016, so in 2017, it'll start somewhere in late May. Okay, so these coming up here are more statistically significant, and it's multiple choice. So just to give you a sense that the students could get 62% knew it was Islamic, 38% knew it was a fast, and with the Pew, there it is, 52% could accurately choose out of those 3 options that Ramadan is the Islamic holy month. All right, question 11. Which of the following is not one of the 10 commandments? A, B, C, or D? Who says A? Who says B? All right, who says C? All right, who says D? All right, 55% could answer that correctly, which I don't know. You might find that really scary. And this isn't about being Christian. In many ways, some of these questions are about being religiously literate, about basic things that everyone should know about, I think, every kind of religion. When does the Jewish Sabbath begin? Friday. You sure? Friday? All right, 45% can answer that correctly. Which of the following best describes the Catholic teaching about the bread and wine during the Eucharist? Actually or symbols? 40% could answer that correctly, though I'm going to point out this is a problematic question. In what religion are Vishnu and Shiva central figures? A, B, or C? B? Is that your final answer? All right. Only 38% could answer that correctly. Again, this is multiple choice. Which Bible figure is most closely associated with remaining obedient to God despite suffering? 38% could answer that correctly. What's ironic is he actually wasn't that patient. If you read the story clearly, carefully. What was Joseph Smith's religion? All right. 51% knew that. According to rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court, is a public school teacher permitted to lead a class in prayer or not? No. Okay, so they understand that part. I did have someone ask me, though, what happens if they were leading a prayer as an educational exercise? I said, I cannot think of an example of a teacher leading a prayer where it would just be an example of an exercise. 18, though. According to rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court, is a public school teacher permitted to read from the Bible as an example of literature or not?
Yes.
Who says yes? Who says no? The answer is yes, but only 23% can get this one correct, which is, I think, a good example of how we misunderstand First Amendment, about the free exercise and the establishment clauses. I read the book of Job in my public high school as an example of literature in my IB English course in my junior year of high school. I bet there are other examples of people in your public schools reading something from the Bible as an example of world literature. Which of these religions aims at nirvana, the state of being free from suffering? 36, almost done. Which of these preachers participated in the period of religious activity known as the First Great Awakening? This isn't religion, this is American history. Do you remember? Was it Jonathan Edwards? 11% could get that correct. So, what the public knows about religion, about 2/3 know public school teachers cannot lead a class in prayer. Atheist is someone who doesn't believe in God, that Mother Teresa was Catholic. Less than 1/3 know that most people in Indonesia are Muslim. Public school teachers can read from the Bible. Jonathan Edwards participated in the First Great Awakening, and Maimonides was Jewish. A couple of things. Why does this knowledge matter, though, other than to sound cool at cocktail parties? Why does this matter? Well, there's a lot of reasons. This is about the application of facts. For example, what is a gospel? Would you be able, if you're Christian, to explain what a gospel is in a cogent and accurate and concise way without going, blah, 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 I don't know, well. Story of the good news. So, and why are there four? And then the questions may continue. Why are there four? Why don't they agree? And we could go on and on. Why this is why it's about the application of knowledge as well. Are Hindu texts sacred? The same way that the Bible is, for example. Name the holy book of Islam. Is Quranic revelation like or unlike biblical revelation? How do we interpret texts in two different traditions? They are actually very different. George Bush in the inaugural speech, a sign of cultural literacy and familiarity. What difference do these names make? Why would a Jew have some questions with you calling their sacred text the Old Testament?
Because it is their text.
It is, yeah. There was an early heresy called supersessionism, where the idea was, oh, thank God we're Christians and we have the New Testament. Oh, those poor Jews, they have the Old Testament. It's outdated. We've got the updated version. Which of the following best describes? This is a problematic question because I know this leads to has led to some anti-Catholic sentiment that those Catholics literally believe that if you ate you take the wafer and you take the wine and you kind of cut a Catholic open right afterwards, that it would be literally turned into flesh and blood. And we'd have to go back and read a little bit of Aristotle as interpreted through Aquinas to see that it's far more complicated than that. Does suffering mean the same thing? I just had a conversation over email with a former student about this one. Is the notion of suffering similar between Christianity and Buddhism? It's not. How are gods understood when it comes to Hinduism as well? That was one of the hardest things that monotheistic Christians during colonial times in India had with Hindus. I couldn't figure it out. Are they polytheistic? Are they monotheistic? It really, and that's always when I teach world religions, I love to start with Hinduism because it just messes with students' brains when you come at things from an Eastern standpoint. So my thesis in general is we lack basic information and engagement skills that we would not tolerate in other academic disciplines, much like our attempts to catch up with years of education and not paying attention to the rest of the world, see our science, technology, engineering, and math. The lack of basic information and skills is now coming back to haunt us, whether it be in world politics or the simple ability to talk to our neighbors. All right? So I just find that you talk about math, and there's a certain level of literacy. You talk about literature, there's a certain level of literacy. But then suddenly you talk about religion, and it all becomes personal and opinion and belief. And then, well, that's what you believe, or that's what they believe, or that's just your opinion. And we've got to be able to raise the standard when it comes to our dialogue about this strange and wonderful thing we call religion or faith or belief. Because, again, it doesn't take long to look into the headlines. To see religion having a very active role in our lives. Okay, I'm gonna do a big data dump, a little bit about our context. So let me start with my context, Houston, Texas, which is now considered the most diverse region in the United States. And how we look in Houston now, the rest of America is going to look by 2050. So we're the city that eats other cities. You could fit Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, and Philadelphia into our 600 square miles. You look up urban sprawl in the dictionary, and there's a picture of Houston. It's a fabulous city in so many ways. Our 10-county region, I always tell people, it ever feels like when you're driving around Houston, it feels like you've driven across a state, it's because you have. Our 10-county region's bigger than the state of New Jersey. Our demographics have changed incredibly over the last 50 years, where in 1960, our Harris County's Asian population was just 0.3%. And over the span of about 50 years, while still at 6.8% in 2014, I'll let someone do the math to figure out what percentage fold increase that is over 50 years. 700-fold or so? While our Anglo population has decreased, our African American population, interestingly, stays about stable, and our Latino population has increased. But has really created within Harris County, and even more pronounced in our suburban areas. An area southwest of Houston called Fort Bend County is now considered the most diverse county in America when it comes to the percentage distribution of the 4 major ethnic traditions, or ethnic groups, or racial composition. And with this sort of diversity also comes geographic diversity, comes religious diversity. When I would take my students, my high school students, on a tour, a world religions tour, there's a place in Fort Bend County you could stop, and within about a 5-mile radius, you could get 3 types of Muslims, 2 types of Hindus, as many Christian churches as you could count, Zoroastrians, Baha'i. I know I'm leaving somebody out. So it was a very easy place. You'd head there and you do your tour. I'm going to skip through these. So this is what Harris County looked like in 2013 when it came to non-Hispanic whites and all others. And notice you need to get into this age bracket before, where is it? Non-Hispanic whites have a larger percentage of this age group over non-Hispanic whites. So unless this group starts having a lot of babies real fast, we know what demographically Harris County is going to look like over the next 20 to 30 years. It's not good, it's not bad, it just is. Just like whether it's ethnic diversity, racial diversity, religious diversity, that ship has sailed. And we have to learn how to live together as neighbors in a world that looks very different than it did 50 years ago. And what's interesting is that how my county looks right now in 2013, here are the projections nationally in 2050. So just take a mental picture of this, and here's all of the US in 2050, and they look remarkably the same. So how we look now, this is how the US is going to look by 2050. Very different than it did in 1950. Not good. And I'm sure America looked very different in 1950 than it did in 1900. We've worked through these changes before. Change is not, if there's one thing that's constant, it's change. This seeing eye chart, I'm going from Houston, I'm going now nationally. This is the religious composition of US adults nationally. And it's got 2 columns, 2007 and 2014, showing the differences over 7 years recently. And you can find this at pewforum.org. It's a wonderful resource I would highly suggest. And what's interesting is, when a person was asked what box to check, they had a lot. Look at all the options they had. Evangelical Protestant tradition, a whole column of options. Mainline Protestant tradition, not just Lutheran, but 2 kinds of Lutherans. Restorationists, I don't even know what a restorationist is. Reformed in the mainline tradition. Historically black churches, Catholic, Mormon, Jehovah's Witnesses, Orthodox Christians, all the way down through other non-Christian faiths. Everyone's, kind of done their thing over the last 7 years, though what's very interesting is this, and here's the summary. The difference between 2007 and 2014, Protestants lost, Catholics lost, other religions gained in 2014, but what really gained was this group we call the nuns. Not nuns in a habit, but nuns, N-O-N-E-S. We call them the unaffiliateds, the spiritual but not religious. We call them atheists. We call them agnostics. Though what's interesting is here in this unaffiliated, they had the option to check either atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. So they had those options. The vast majority of this 22.8% in 2014, 16% were nothing in particular. And I'm sure the Roaring Fork Valley is full of these spiritual but not religious, and they tend to skew younger into the millennial group. It's not that they're not religious. It's not that they're antithetical to religion. It's that the religion that they're practicing and that they're looking at and they're experiencing is very different than their parents, which again is nothing new. Some people say 3.1% of the American population is atheist. We've got an epidemic. I would disagree. I would say that we've always had atheists in America. It's that there's been such a stigma to that name that they just haven't been public about claiming that sort of title. What's even more interesting is that I would argue that atheism acts a lot like a religion. And atheists in many ways are starting to denominationalize. I'm atheist. I used to be part of those atheists, but I'm part of this atheist group now. It's very interesting. There's even a church in Houston of the Church of the Atheists. It's an atheist church. It's fascinating. Religious composition, left vertical column is 2010, right vertical column is 2050. So Christian people who claim to be Christian will dip by 2050 from 3/4 to 2/3 of the US population. But the gains in there won't happen here. We'll still go from 0.9 to, in 2050, there are only 2.1% of the US population will be Muslim. The group that's going to gain will be almost 10 percentage points of this group called the unaffiliated. Okay? Before I go on to world, are there any questions, just anything you're thinking at this point, mostly about this national data? Does this jive? Does this sound familiar? Does this feel like your experience either here in the Roaring Fork Valley or wherever else that you live? If current trends continue by 2050, the number of Muslims will nearly equal the number of Christians. India will retain a Hindu majority, but will also have the largest Muslim population of any country in the world, surpassing Indonesia. This is where I'm telling students right now, if you're interested in writing a thesis on religion, write it right here on this demographic shift, as India, instead of Indonesia, becomes the most populous Muslim country. Watching Muslims and Hindus who have a very complicated history, especially since partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. Here in the US, Christians will decline from 3/4 to 2/3. Judaism will no longer be the largest non-Christian religion, and Muslims will be more numerous in the US than people who identify as Jewish on the basis of religion. It's neither good, neither bad, it just is. This train has left the station. So we need to figure out how we're going to work with these realities. Question?
Will Muslims increase because people will move here or because people will change to the Muslim religion?
I think a little bit of both. I think my guess is more the former than the latter of people moving here than necessarily going through conversion.
They also have more children.
And they also have more children. That's the pure. That's also the case as well. Just interestingly, geographic distribution of religious groups. And just interesting to know, overall global population, 60% of the global population lives in the Asia Pacific. Only 5% is here in North America. And then you can see here the vast majority of Hindus live in Asia. Very, very few live outside of the Asia Pacific. We really, here in the West, didn't have our first serious encounters with Hinduism until probably about 1850. It's a very new discovery, for lack of a better term, between West and East when it comes to Hinduism. Same thing with Buddhists, folk religionists, other religions, unaffiliated, Muslims, Christians, again, have more of a distribution. And the vast majority of Jews either live in Israel or they live here in the United States. Interesting. If you're interested, the folk religionists are African traditional religions, Chinese folk religions, Native American religions, Australian Aboriginal religions. And other religions would be Baha'is, Jains, Sikhs, Taoists, followers of Tenriko, Wiccans, Zoroastrians, and many, many others. This is the size and projected growth of major religious groups between 2010 and 2050. Probably the number that makes me the most nervous is actually this one, that there's going to be 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. But you can see that at least Christianity will maintain a relatively stable percentage of world percentage. Islam will grow. It's interesting, unaffiliated will drop. But here in the West, like in France or in the US, the percentages will go up. But worldwide, people who are considered unaffiliated, the percentages will drop. How many religions? Whatever religion you're comfortable with or familiar with, you probably know a little bit about the multiplicity of the manifestations of that religion. Every religion has the multiplicity of manifestations. They're as complicated and messy as your religious tradition. Maybe in some cases even messier. Before I go through a couple of thoughts on where interfaith is going, when it comes to interfaith relations. Now again, I told you it was going to be kind of drinking out of a fire hose, but as I said, I don't know the next time I'm going to see you. So I wanted to try to give you as much information without going overboard, which I probably did, and I apologize. So questions on some of this material? Yes, ma'am.
When we moved down here, nobody has ever heard about the Chaldeans.
Uh-huh.
And if you look at the Iraq map,
Uh-huh.
they started in the upper east corner
Great.
of the country.
The Chaldeans in Iraq.
They're Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there are not very many of them, except in Michigan, especially Dearborn.
Right. And what's interesting, too, is Dearborn is an epicenter of Islam in America as well. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting where people end up. People didn't probably hear of the Yazidis until ISIS started slaughtering them by the hundreds in Iraq as well. So there's lots of different religions out there. Other thoughts? Yes, sir.
It seems to me that there are a lot of religions.
There are a lot of religions.
It also seems to me that the number of faiths depend on the number of supposed revelations from God.
Yes.
As a religious historian,
Yes.
how many so-called revelations from God are there out there?
How many revelations from God are there out there? Oh, wow.
You don't have to answer to me.
So if I had more time, and I've done other presentations, we'd have to parse those questions. What do we mean, for example, because you used two different words. You used religion and you used faith. And I don't know if those two words are the same.
No, they're not.
And we would add into their belief as well, and we'd have to kind of parse those as well. But isn't it interesting, though, how many revelations is that, when there's a new revelation, they tend to be in two different categories. It's either the update or the purification. We have figured out the original intent of this faith, and we're practicing it in its pure form, not the corrupt form that has happened. Or we got a new update. We got a new update to the software. And so what's really interesting historically is a period of time between about 1840 and 1890 where there were those updates in three different religions. You had LDS, you had Joseph Smith getting the new revelation, you had a group called Arya Samaj in Hinduism, which was in some ways a Hindu reform movement. And you also had the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam, which was seen as an update, or in many ways a completion of Islam, that the Messiah had come. There are, again, sects of Islam that have a messianic figure, particularly in Shia Islam. They're waiting for called sort of monotheism do it, has had some sort of revelation. And then we'd have to go talk about those traditions that aren't monotheistic. So I could think of probably 9 or 10 off the top of my head, and there's probably even more than that. Yes, ma'am?
So that leads into a question that I have. I think that a lot of people see, especially the data that you had there at the end, so maybe you can answer this question in light of where we go with an interfaith discussion.
Okay.
I think that a lot of people have a lot of fear, as Christians especially, but probably other religions as well. I'll just speak for the one that I know.
Yep.
That
That one. Yeah.
Yeah, that how much it's going, that our, Christianity is going to decrease in the next 30 years. And so rather than, well, I won't hypothesize, how do we have conversations around understanding maybe the truth of the other religions or these revelations from God in other religions, as opposed to we need to convert more people.
Right.
That's our charge as
Right.
Christians.
Right.
People, we are evangelical by
Right.
nature.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so how do we reconcile that as people of faith?
Right, and I've been asked that question many times. How can you be a bridge builder across religions and still call yourself a Christian? I've been accused of not being a real Christian. And that's fine. I understand the point, and I usually say it is actually the very fact that I am a Christian that I do this work. The very fact that we are called to be peacemakers, bridge builders, where there is a lack of understanding, we build understanding. Where there is the threat of violence, we find ways to build to ameliorate that violence. And I will just let my ministry speak for itself. As what St. Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel at all times and when necessary, use words. Because as I often say, when was the last time you were in an interfaith dialogue and you said, oh, you're not Christian? Did you know you're going to hell? How did that work? It doesn't. It doesn't. It is a conversation stopper. It is a relationship stopper. So I think some of my thoughts here may help in that direction. But are there other questions before I go into? Oops, sorry. There. Other thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
And we said that the Christians will shrink, but I don't know that that's true. I think what's true is that if you look at the growth in population, the other ones are growing and
Yeah.
we're stagnating.
Yeah.
So the end result is we become less.
And it's not so our numbers are changing, but that doesn't change our ministry, and it doesn't change any of these. They're just numbers.
Yeah.
They're just numbers. In some ways, we're going to have to, and I'm speaking from a Christian paradigm in a lot of ways, we're going to have to stop being lazy. And let me explain what I mean by that. For a long time, we've been able, as Christians, and I'll say we, and within my tradition, I don't want to assume y'all's traditions, we've been able to let the culture do a lot of the work for us. We've never had to ask for Christmas off. We've never usually had to ask for Good Friday off. Most public schools still have Good Friday off. We've never had to do certain things that, as you watch, people out of the Jewish tradition have to fight for Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, or watching Muslims now fight for Eid al-Adha, Eid al-Fitr, really the two most important holidays, the end of the fasting and also the Eid al-Adha, which is the feast day that commemorates the sacrifice of Abraham. Or it's really not a sacrifice because Isaac didn't die. That's why in Hebrew it's called the Akedah, which is the Hebrew word for binding. It's called the binding of Isaac. So we're going to have to do some evangelism, or we're going to have to remember what it is to be Christians in this world, and we won't be able to rely so much on culture to do the work for us. All right. Yes, ma'am.
You said when your dad came to the United States,
Yes.
or to America, that he was from China.
Yeah.
So what religion was he?
What religion was he? Nominally Christian. He finished high school at a Catholic high school in Hong Kong, but even more, I think for me the more helpful answer is, being biracial. I've got a side of my family that's, my mother can trace her roots back to the American Revolution. Technically, I'm first generation American on my father's side. And I remember little household gods being in my grandparents' house, all the while I was going to Presbyterian church every Sunday. And so, I guess there's no accidents about why we end up doing what we're doing, but I often tell that story about growing up the child both of two cultures, but of also in some ways two religious experiences. So, other questions? All right, Charlotte, I think some of this will answer. Here are some of the things I've been talking about. First of all, challenge number one, I will call the failure of interfaith dialogue. For the last 50 years, I would say we have worked with the Houston Smith paradigm. World's Religions was published in the mid-50s and has sold over 2 million copies, which is a ton of copies for a book on religion. And he was and espoused what's often called the perennial philosophy, this notion that the reason that religions look a lot alike is that there is some kernel of the divine impulse in all of them that makes them alike. Whether how they talk about God, if they're monotheistic, or their religious and ethical maxims. And so often what has been used is the metaphor of a mountain. One mountain, many paths. And Jews are on one path, and Christians are on a path, and Zoroastrians are on a path, and Baha'i are on a path, and Sikhs are on a path. And oh boy, won't we all be surprised when we get to the top. And we're all, oh, you're here too? This was your destination as well? I thought you were going to hell. And that's been a very helpful paradigm in a lot of ways, as interfaith dialogue was really in its baby steps. You could really trace interreligious dialogue in the West back to about 1896 with the first Parliament of World Religions, I believe, in Chicago. But as Stephen Prothero, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote a book on world religions called God is Not One, very provocative title, he asks, well, if we're all the same, why are we killing each other? So he would say, the mountain paradigm is really nice, but it's not helping reality. So he's claiming, and I do as well, that we're going to have to talk about our differences as much as our similarities, and we need to get out of what we call the kumbaya culture. Like, I'm a Jew, I'm a Muslim, we talk together for 2 hours at interfaith dialogue, boy, isn't this make me feel good? But we haven't taken that next step in this dialogue about building trust and relationship to actually talk about some of the more difficult things. That we look at God different ways, that we actually may have different goals. I mean, I would say that a Buddhist really cares very little about salvation. And if a Buddhist does care about salvation, it's in a very, very different way than Christians talk about salvation. We may be after different things, and that doesn't have to be a source of fear or prejudice. It's just different at this point. So I think we are looking, and I wrote an op-ed piece in the Houston Chronicle a couple of Sundays ago about this, that we need a new model for interreligious dialogue for the next 50 years. I'm breaking the cardinal rule of PowerPoints by putting up a lot of text, but this one's really important. This is from a Huffington Post article from 2011 by a rabbi named Eric Yaffe, and it's called Why Interfaith Doesn't Work. And I love these parts. And he says these three things if these three things happen, this is when interfaith dialogue actually gets productive and interesting. Otherwise, it just gets god-awful boring. Meaningful dialogue happens when the conversation turns to our religious differences. Interreligious exchanges become compelling. This is one of the most important paragraphs that I use. When my colleagues and partners give expression to their religious passions, I'm drawn in when they share their deepest beliefs and strangest customs, no matter how radically other than they are from my own. And the sharing of religious passions should lead to passionate debate in which we struggle with the really hard questions. Interreligious dialogue truly touches us when we can discuss what we all know to be true, but we rarely say, that in some ways at least, we all believe in the exceptionalism of our own traditions. That is so true. That's why it's called belief and not just a good idea I'm entertaining right now. And I tell people that if you're Christian, for example, and you're sitting around a table with 5 or 6 people from different religions, however strongly you feel about your religious tradition, they feel as strongly about the correctness or rightness of their religious traditions as well. And the fun begins when you really try to figure out how to build lines of communication across those claims to exceptionalism. That's why, in many ways, it's ironic that you would think that the folks who say, oh, all religions are the same, shouldn't we just be able to get along, would be my favorite people to engage in interreligious dialogue. They're actually my least favorite people to engage, because there's nothing to engage. If I was going to have to work with a polarity, I'd really want to work with the people who are over on this side who say, I'm right, they're wrong. Because there's actually something to work with there than the folks who are over here saying, just does, all these differences are not differences. We're all the same. Let's just live in peace while we basically ignore our differences at our own peril. Another challenge, really the biggest challenge is that challenge number 1, the failure of interfaith dialogue and where we're going next. So, yes. Talk about tolerance? I will at the end, actually. So, what we talk about when we talk about atheism, just a couple of, I found this piece in The Guardian a couple of months ago written by a fellow who is an atheist. And he says, but my conviction that there is no God is nonetheless a leap of faith. Isn't that interesting to think about? We have, just as we've been able to prove there is a God, we have also been unable to prove that there isn't one. The feeling that I have in my being that there is no God is what I go by, but I'm not deluded into thinking that feeling is in any way more factual than the deep conviction by theists that God exists. I keep this fact in mind that my atheism is a leap of faith because otherwise it's easy to get cocky. It's easy to look at acts of terror committed in the name of different gods, debates about the role of women in various churches, unfamiliar and elaborate religious rules and rituals, and think, look at those foolish religious folk doing their quaint little religious practices. It's easy to view religion as the root of society's ills. And if you've read some of the militant atheists, Sam Harris, Hitchens, I always forget what often called the unholy trinity of atheist writers. That's what they say. There's a title of a book. It's called Religion Poisons Everything. Faith is not the enemy, and words in a book are not responsible for the atrocities we commit as human beings, though that is of a point of disagreement. We need to constantly examine and expose our nature as pack animals who are constantly trying to define the other in order to feel safe through all the systems we build in society. Only then will we be as free from dogma as we atheists claim to be. Finally, just a word on spiritual but not religious. Let me just... a couple of quotes from Emily Click. She's at Harvard Divinity School, and she was just a lovely interview with her called A Call for Wisdom in an Age of Information. And it's pointed out this, that millennials, Americans aged 18 to 34, anybody know a millennial? Anybody live with a millennial? Who say, interestingly, they talk to God, outnumber those who say they do not talk to God by almost a 2-to-1 margin. At the same time, only a bare majority of this cohort say they look to religion for guidance. So there seems to be a disconnect. So this is something I think faith communities can offer. So the question was, why don't 18 to 34-year-olds ask old who say they talk to God also look to organized religion for guidance? And Click says this, millennials have an abundance of places to turn for what they understand to be guidance. What they may not yet realize is that there is a significant divide between information and wisdom in relation to guidance. Anybody figured that one out? Probably many of them turn to Facebook, to blogs, and they get some valuable information there. They gather information wherever they can. They need to experience the difference between gathering information and being embraced by wisdom. Love that line. I think many millennials are intrigued by Jon Stewart or John Oliver because they operate with very impressive levels of wisdom, but their insights are often tainted by cynicism. Millennials need to experience the power of building an interpretive framework that draws upon more than cultural resources, but also turns to the wisdom of religious traditions. That's when they realize that the folks who are trying to carry these pieces of wisdom often, though certainly not always, are found in religious institutions. All of that, but the bad I word, institution. That's, I think, what faith communities with those deep historical connections, that deep historical trajectory, that arc of history, that for a lot of traditions didn't begin at the beginning of time, but actually, in that mystical, spiritual, it began even before time, that we can stand in that stream and have those resources available. So again, and I mentioned this a little earlier, why is this important to Christians? I was at a gala for our organization where 2 Hindus and a Jew were being honored. And a very devout evangelical Christian asked this question. I knew exactly what she was asking. She said, "Are we wrong? Are we wrong? I'm sitting here as a Christian with my, I think my understanding is of what my call is to go forth and make disciples of all the nations, while I'm watching people from these other traditions being not only honored, but being respected, being listened to." And so again, as I said, neither of these polarities work. But again, I'm always more interested in working with this crowd than that crowd in a strange way. Of course, I'd love to work with people in the middle, which is where most of us are. And so in conclusion,
Could you go back when I couldn't finish reading?
oh, sorry. And so what we're finding, too, is that we're another set of words that we're working with here. The word that has been the buzzword in interreligious dialogue for the last 20 or 30 years has been tolerance, interfaith tolerance. And that's been a good word, but it's not good enough anymore. Because when you think about it, when was the last time you were tolerated? And how did you feel? People don't like to be tolerated. So we're looking more towards understanding and respect, I think, as being the words that will carry us forward. And respect doesn't need to be that I totally agree with you or that I think everything about your faith is just hunky-dory, but that we can find ways in which to work and interact together, and that we can even disagree. In conclusion, my favorite 3 rules of interfaith engagement are from Krister Stendahl. Krister Stendahl was the dean of Harvard Divinity School for many years. He was also the Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm as well. And he has 3 rules for interfaith dialogue. And the first is, let the other define. If you're really interested in what a Muslim believes, first and foremost, ask a Muslim. But don't force that Muslim's point of view to represent the faith of 1 billion people. Understand that just like if I asked you about your faith, and I would be getting the point of view of a certain person. And that's why when I would preach to, let's say, 200 people who are all there because they were at a Christian worship service, I wasn't looking at one strain of Christianity, in this case often Presbyterians. I would be looking at 200 strains of Christianity in a lot of cases. Let the other define, which really means that we have to be curious. We have to remember how to think. I am always frustrated that suddenly when we're talking about religion, people's brains turn off. But you can't really, because it's not something you think about, it's something you believe about or something you feel about. It is something you think about. That brain needs to stay on. That critical thinking needs to stay on. That critical, curious inquiry, asking questions, needs to stay engaged. Compare best with best. Don't compare the best in your religion with the worst in another religion. That's not fair. And then my favorite is what he calls practice holy envy. Don't be afraid to see something in another tradition and say, wow, that's kind of cool. One of the modern founders of the modern study of religion is a German, and they're all, in the early days, German scholars, is a guy named Max Müller. And he said, the person who knows one religion knows none. Perhaps you've heard that quote before. The person who knows one religion knows none. And he was really the founder of comparative religion. Because what he's saying is, if you don't understand more than one religion, you really don't get an understanding of your own. And I have found that to be absolutely true. In many ways, the study of religion does that. It makes the familiar strange and the strange familiar. It makes the familiar, what you've known, imagine yourself a fish. The fish doesn't see the water. The water that you've been swimming in suddenly becomes a little odd. Wow, I guess the whole, other people don't see things the way I do, don't believe the way I do. That there's a picture of a God with 4 hands, 4 arms, riding on a mouse with the head of an elephant. And that actually is a very complex symbol that means more than I can even understand without a lot of study and asking questions. And then it makes the strange familiar. It takes things that don't seem, even in some cases, human, and make them actually within the human realm. And with that, I'll conclude the formal part of the conversation. Thank you. So we got like about 30 minutes or so, is that about right? And again, we don't have to go for all 30, but I'd love questions, thoughts. Yes, ma'am, we'll start in the back.
This doesn't have to do with religion as much as it does. In the beginning of your talk, you said that Houston can fit in Philadelphia, Chicago, etc.
Yes.
What about Los Angeles? Isn't that bigger than Houston?
It is, but so Los Angeles is bigger. So I'm not saying Houston's the biggest city. I think right now, a lot of statistical data will say Houston's the most diverse region in the United States, even more diverse than LA and New York. So that's more the claim at this point.
I believe that.
Really?
Yes. Having been to, of course, both of those places.
So I think, I'm not saying that LA and New York are incredibly diverse, but when it comes to it, I think that some of the things where Houston's an interesting place is, number one, the variety and how much they're spread out. Like, for example, with New York, they tend to be in certain pockets. And in many cases where you could go through whole neighborhoods and feel like you're in another part of the world. Houston is in many cases much more integrated. Particularly, not the urban core, but interestingly in Houston, it's the suburban rings, where in many ways economics is driving that, because that's where the affordable housing is.
So was that changed because of Katrina?
No, that change has been happening probably since the 1980s in many ways, because Houston has had a very diverse working population with our oil and gas backbone bringing international. We have more Fortune 500 companies headquarters than any other city other than New York. So we've been a very diverse, cosmopolitan, international city for a long time. We're very welcoming. We still have in many ways a frontier mentality that if hard work, you can make it, and we don't care how you put your pants on, as long as you're a good neighbor and you work hard. And we also just have, because of our geographic location, a strong influx from Central America. So we don't just have a Latino community, but we have Guatemalan, Honduran, Mexican, El Salvadoran communities that are very distinct. We've had Vietnamese communities, we have a large Chinatown, we have Pakistani Muslim communities, we have Arab Muslim communities, we've got Hindu communities, so that, and especially in the suburban areas, are quite integrated.
How is the crime rate versus the New York and LA?
I couldn't tell you. I think generally, though, I think American crime rates are actually falling in general. So, but I couldn't answer that accurately. So, other thought? Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me. My daughter sends her 2 kids to a religious school, and the mothers whose children go to a public school often ask my daughter, or states that, why are you sending the kids there? What's the difference between evolution
And creation.
and creation?
Mm-hmm.
And then my daughter's answer is, who made that thing that came out of the water or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
Who made that?
So is there a question? I want to make sure I answer a question. Is there a question in your statement? Okay. Oh, I mean, if you wanted my take on the teaching of evolution versus the teaching of creationism, we'll talk afterwards. So. Other questions? Other thoughts? We can continue this offline as well, but other.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about.
Yeah.
In some ways, the lack of opportunity, unless you initiate it personally, to learn about other ones. I was invited a number of years ago to a colleague's daughter's bat mitzvah.
Bat mitzvah.
And I had never been to something like that.
Uh-huh.
I thought it was so cool.
It's very interesting. Everything's in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that I thought is, my understanding from what I learned then was that for a year, his daughter had studied
Yes.
as a better person
Mhm.
to learn the traditions and the language
Mhm.
and been coached. And then there
So-
was this huge party.
Bat mitzvah takes a lot of work.
And I thought, wouldn't it be great if every young teenager had a mentor for a year
Mhm.
who coached and encouraged and worked with them, and then they reached a culmination.
The rite of passage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I thought, my God, wouldn't that be cool if every child had that opportunity?
And that in some ways was the origins of Christian confirmation, probably, is watching bar and bat mitzvah. Except, sadly, in a lot of cases, that confirmation, which maybe takes, in a lot of churches, maybe, 2 Saturdays, 3 Saturdays, in some ways is not graduation into the larger life of the church. It's graduation out of the larger life of the church, ironically, when it comes to a lot of... We've really, I think, missed the boat in a lot of Protestant denominations in developing a really good rite of passage that Muslims have, that Jews have, that Catholics have, that the Catholic strain of Christianity has as well. And we're finding those in other places. Boy Scouts wrote the book on rite of passage rituals. And that's the power of ritual. And that's why the ritual is really, really cool, is that, and when you look at it cross-culturally and cross-religiously, what rituals do to move people from one stage to another, saying that they are now into another stage of their development and have new rights and responsibilities within the community as well. But to go back to your first, it is difficult to initiate those, because there are 3 things that we've been taught not to talk about in polite company. Politics, sex, and religion. And it's so we've been trained from a young age within our culture we're not well trained to initiate conversations when it comes to religion. We're either nervous that we're going to sound prejudiced or that we're going to sound stupid. And that's a lot of the work that I do, is trying to create avenues for asking those questions, for initiating relationships.
Because I realized if I hadn't happened to have that colleague whose daughter happened to be at that stage,
You would have missed it.
I would know
Yep.
as little now as I did before
Yep.
about the whole process.
Right now, with our interfaith dialogues that we're planning at the end of October, we're actually working with mosques to host with 9 or 10 mosques in the Houston area to host our dialogues, to give people the opportunity to come into a mosque and see Muslims at prayer, have dinner, be able to ask those questions, to give people those opportunities. Yes, ma'am?
I have another question.
Yeah.
I want to come back to your, the woman at the dinner who said, "Are we wrong?"
Yeah.
How'd you answer her?
Pastorally. The pastor in me came out and I said, I understand your question, because she was really happy to be there. I think it was more, she wasn't sitting there stone-faced saying, I shouldn't be here. She was, she had that kind of, that opening of that wondering of, but the way that I'd answer it in some ways is, we have to kind of find a way to move away from this, we're children of the Enlightenment, where everything is either a 1 or a 0, an on or an off, a right or a wrong. And I would contend that religion is not a zero-sum game. That the opposite of one truth, and I'm quoting Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, may be another truth, and not a falsehood. and that these truths may actually be able to exist together, and that it's not a zero-sum game. I'm not gaining a lot of traction, I think, but with this paradigm, but I think it is a very true paradigm. We're finding that in quantum physics left and right. Things can be a particle and a wave at the same time, for example.
So
We can have a deep conviction in what we believe while also having a door open.
Yeah, or that I can have a deep conviction and they can have a deep conviction, and I love this story. I preached at a Unitarian Universalist church one time, and they're in many ways, very liberal. They welcome everybody. And I said, don't lie to me. You all want everybody to be Unitarian Universalists. And they said a resounding, absolutely yes. Everybody thinks they're right. So I can still think that I want everyone to be Christian, or to have that transformative experience of Jesus Christ. And not, again, we often talk about being Christian or being Muslim or being Hindu as an identity rather than a practice. And that's what kind of messes, that's a big difference as well between East and West. In the West, we tend to be orthodoxic, meaning that in order to be this, you need to believe the right things. Eastern religions tend to be orthopraxic, and Judaism's this way as well in a lot of ways. That it's not about what you believe, it's what you do. What's the proper thing to do? So I think that's another thing to work on as well, is that it's not about saying the right magic words, but actually in some ways to continue with this metaphor to an absurd end, doing the right magic things. So, yes, ma'am.
I have a large group of Jewish friends.
Uh-huh.
And they feel that really that's their culture. They don't go to synagogue. Some of them go on the high holy days.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say 80% of them don't.
Right.
So there's a difference there as well.
There is a difference between an understanding, especially within Judaism, of Judaism being a heritage or a culture. And so you may find such things as Jewish atheists or people who are Jewish but never attend synagogue. But I would also claim I could probably say the same thing among Christians as well, that we're finding that more and more. People say that they're Christian, but they don't practice or do things that set them off as Christians.
But my Jewish friends definitely believe in their God, the Jewish God, the
Sure.
New Testament God.
Yeah,
For the most part.
sure.
They just do not
Practice.
work in this.
And I think there's something unique then within the Jewish experience, though, that we have to remember, that being Jewish and claiming and holding on to that is really important when you've been through something like the Holocaust.
Well, and Israel is a major part
Sure,
of it, too.
sure. But it's interesting to try to find, again, those comparative points where it's unique to Judaism, but it's not unusual, but it's not solely a Jewish thing. I've seen that happen within Christianity, and I'm seeing that within Islam as well, especially as the children of immigrants grow up American.
Really?
So
Can you tell us more about that?
oh, just the same thing that we all and many immigrants worry about is, how do I keep my children within my faith or within my culture? It happens with every immigrant culture, and we are a nation of immigrants, and that's been a good thing. Did you have a question? Okay.
I just want to tell everyone a shocking thing about Mormons.
Yes.
Number one, we were giving our best friend's 25th anniversary, and we were doing it.
Yes.
The Mormons would not let their son to the party.
Uh-huh.
And then that son married a Mormon.
Uh-huh.
And when they got married, his parents had to sit outside.
Oh, interesting. Religion is an interesting thing. Remember, the Puritans didn't celebrate Christmas either. So there's lots of ways that religions seek to make themselves distinct, and especially new religious experiences in a new cultural context. Paul, question?
If you, with the little bit that you've been here at Snowmass Village, Snowmass Chapel, if you would cast a vision for us, what do you think we could do here?
The vision for my sense is that a lot of people come to the Roaring Fork Valley because they love it and it feels a little secluded, sheltered, isolated, better weather, lots of stuff to do. I would continue to try, and I know it's difficult to think about the Roaring Fork Valley as a whole community, from Glenwood all the way up to Independence Pass. And then always, how do we find ways to expand our circles? And to remember that there's still a big world going on outside of Pitkin County. So I think those are the things. But I know it's a struggle to maintain the identity and the beauty of this area, but also taking the risk in of seeing who's down the street, who's down the road, who's over in Rifle, who's over in, over in, I don't know, Dotsero, Battle Mount. Is that Battle Mount? No, that's wrong. Okay, Parachute. Yeah.
So given that we have such a large Hispanic population in the valley here, what are some of the significant faith issues that we should be paying attention to?
Probably, of course, the ones you probably have figured out already: race, class, economic issues. I would suggest that whatever you do, try to do it together. We have lots. Again, Houston's a large area, but we have lots of little regional interfaith groups going on. And one of the things that we're trying to do is connect them together, because there was a group in the south part of Houston that was starting to get together. And one of the things they did as an interfaith thing was an interfaith Thanksgiving service. That's often one of the first things interfaith groups do, is something at Thanksgiving. I wish I would have known that, because there was a group on the north side of town in an area called the Woodlands that's been doing an interfaith Thanksgiving service for 20 years. And I could have gotten them to give this group in the south a lot of pointers. So my major suggestion is whatever you do, try to do it together with other congregations and civic authorities.
So funny you should mention that. That is a
Super.
perfect segue.
Yes,
I'm
it is.
gonna
This is a
kinda
good time.
wrap it up unless people can stay as
Yeah.
long as they want, but I know that some of you may be on time frame. We are involved in some dialogue with an interfaith. Oh, sorry, I forgot we're on the web. Sorry, Paul has a live stream going. We are involved in some interfaith dialogue and creating really a grassroots program that you all will hear more and more about here at Snowmass Chapel. We're doing a 3-day training. The Manaus Fund here in the Valley is funding that, and the clergy from the Valley who are involved and who are getting their congregations involved will be going to this training to learn exactly how to have that dialogue with each other, bringing in especially our Latino population, but there are lots of issues that we face with the diversity that we have here. And you do look around Aspen and think, well, there's no diversity at all. But there is, and especially, as you said, when you take into account from Aspen all the way to Parachute, which is what we'll be doing. So Robert is a huge champion of this effort, which has just started in about the last 6 months, and we've probably had 4 meetings, individual meetings with the community organizer who's helping us. So you guys will be hearing more about that, and I just thought that was such a neat segue, because it's something this chapel is going to be really involved with, both from a financial standpoint and just manpower, and sitting down and having those really important conversations. So
It's a good place to stop.
it is. Thank you all so much, and thank you to Greg.
Thank you.
So appreciate it.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.